It was night, and near the mountains stood the Quo Vadis New Testament Temple Kuter Zodiaci. A carriage arrived and several men gathered. The bald man spread his hands and with a smile mentioned that it had been a long time and that the Pope seemed to have rejuvenated lately. The long-haired man began to show a smile, while on the other hand, the man carrying a staff noted that the bald man had become quite burly and seemed to be imbued with more divine power. In turn, the bald man replied that the long-haired man, on the contrary, had lost weight and asked if this was due to the new concubine he had taken. The long-haired man was the Manson cult leader, Charles. Sticking out his tongue, with a smile, he explained that she was a young woman who had a husband and that, after whispering to her about the liberation of the soul while teaching her the doctrine, she came to him of her own free will. The bald man was the cult leader, He explained with a laugh that, with just a word, they offered him gold or grain, and because of this, there was no need for his body to move. The man wearing a hat and carrying a staff was the New World cult leader, Elmani. To him, no one would dare challenge the words of God. He pulled a letter from his hat and began to read it attentively. He mentioned that the fact that the Quo Vadis New Testament had sent an invitation for a communion ceremony made him wonder if this meant they would finally recognize them as a branch. As Om's eyes shone with malice, with a smile, he began to rub his hands together, and the image of Saintess Dolores came to his mind. He knew that communion was a ritual to consume bread and white wine, but symbolically, it was also the act of sharing the blood and flesh of a virgin. He considered this a clear invitation to form a formal alliance. They began to walk through the area, and with a serene gaze, Charles mentioned that it was fortunate that the New Testament cultists had finally come to their senses and reached out to them. Began to ponder in silence, while on the other hand, Elmani turned to them and stated that those people had always acted so nobly, but now they finally understood. They understood that they could never win against the Old Testament cultists without their funds. Just at that moment, an explosion occurred behind them. Noticing this, their eyes widened in surprise and confusion as they didn't know what was happening. They stopped and turned towards the direction of the explosion, trying to understand what had happened. The ground was littered with the remains of the carriage destroyed by the explosion and a corpse. As the smoke screen dissipated, a woman began to walk toward them, happy to have found them. It was none other than Uroboros. As a powerful energy surged from her body, she stared at them intently, and an excited smile spread across her face as she wondered why so much trash was gathered in this place. In the blink of an eye, guards carrying shields and swords surrounded Uroboros. At the same time, from a rooftop, Vikir and Dolores were watching everything. Dolores was somewhat surprised, as Uroboros had appeared just as Vikir had said. Vikir, who was crouching beside her, began to stare intently at Uroboros in silence. Uroboros unsheathed her whip. And the others approached her and, in a curious tone, asked her how she had gotten here. Showing a calm expression and a smile, she explained that she had heard a report about the appearance of the night bloodhound. So she came to check it out, but she had only found what she considered a gathering of stinking trash. Hearing this, their eyes widened with rage, and they couldn't help but grit their teeth hard, as they couldn't believe how that insolent bastard dared. As the moon shone high in the sky, they ordered their men to kill her immediately. Hearing the order, they drew their swords and, with a furious gaze, began to charge towards her. Once they got a little closer, Uroboros's eyes began to shine with excitement. Without wasting a single second, she decided it was time to get serious. Just before the guards could react, she moved her whip like a thunderclap, cutting the guards' bodies to pieces. The guards' blood splattered on the faces of and the others, and their eyes widened in surprise and fear. They couldn't believe she had killed the guards in a single attack. As the corpses fell from the sky, Uroboros wiped the blood from her cheek with her finger and, with a curious smile, asked them if they were their leaders. Began to sweat like crazy and gritted his teeth in fear, not knowing what to say. But just then, Charles extended his hand and asked her to wait, questioning how she dared to act this way in front of them. With an arrogant expression, Charles began to point his finger at her, declaring that he was the god of the Manson cult. He added that, now that he thought about it, she seemed to be his type, and if she became his 21st wife, he would make sure she avoided divine punishment. Just before Charles could finish his sentence, Uroboros moved like a thunderclap and, with a whip crack, severed Charles' head, sending it flying through the air. Noticing this, was paralyzed with fear, unable to believe what his eyes were seeing. Uroboros began to stare intently at with a piercing gaze, questioning with disdain how it was possible that someone who couldn't even block her attack dared to call himself a god. Elmani started to look at the ground and, with a furious expression, declared that he was not afraid of trash like her. With a determined expression, he began to point his finger at her, declaring that he would never surrender because he was the true god who had descended upon this world. Although deep down, he was pissing his pants. Uroboros threw a bottle which hit Elmani squarely in the face, causing the liquid to make contact with his skin. With a smile, Uroboros showed the bottle and asked that if he really was a god, nothing would happen to him even if he touched holy water. Once the liquid made contact with Elmani's skin, it began to burn it like acid, causing him to start writhing in pain and screaming in agony. Uroboros turned the bottle to show the label, which had the symbol for poison. Then she put the bottle away, extended her hand, and with a cheerful smile began to walk towards telling him that now he was the only piece of trash left. Began to sweat like crazy and started to back away, begging for his life. He confessed that he was not a god or a priest, but just a cultist, a heretic. Uroboros began to stare intently at with an excited smile, and with her so close, eyes filled with tears and fear as he pleaded with her to please spare him. She placed her foot next to face, revealing that she already knew. Seeing this, gritted his teeth and panicked, knowing this was not good, as a suffocating aura of energy emanated from Uroboros's body. In an arrogant tone, she asked him what any of that mattered. Began to scream like a madman, knowing he had no escape. She grew tired of all the talk and gave what he deserved. Now the ground was filled with blood and corpses. As if nothing had happened, she began to walk through the area. Uroboros began to carefully observe the corpses, wondering if they planned to use her in this way. She started to look at the ground and couldn't help but smile, hoping to meet him one day. Her eyes began to shine and, sticking out her tongue, she grew excited, as the only one who managed to provoke this in her was none other than the Nightblood Hound. Her thoughts were interrupted when a bright light emerged from the trees in the forest. Voices were heard shouting that they had heard a scream coming from beyond that forest and that, this time, they would catch her. Hearing this, she snapped out of her thoughts, turned around, felt furious, and gritted her teeth hard. Then, she braced herself and with a leap, disappeared from the place without a trace. On the ground was who was still alive but his body was covered in whip wounds. Writhing in pain, he began to pant heavily. Vikir stood up and his gaze fixed on He explained to Dolores that he would handle the interrogation, so she should find the document containing the information. Dolores began to watch Vikir attentively in silence. He reached a hand inside his clothes, then descended near pulled out the glowing Decrabia pendant, and as his eyes shone, he demanded that he tell him everything he knew about the financing of these bastards. Once opened his eyes, he saw Decrabia's glowing eye, and it made it clear that before it, even silence was useless, and that he had to tell it everything he knew. Hypnotized by Decrabia's power, began to spit out everything he knew, mentioning a ledger, the financing, and a top-secret document that was located under the carriage. Just then, someone noticed them in front of the temple and shouted to capture them all. Vikir stood up and turned around, while on the other hand, Dolores went on alert, her eyes filled with concern. Dolores felt afraid and Vikir became alert. He couldn't believe they had arrived so quickly. Not long after, someone carrying a spear slammed it hard against the ground. In the middle of the night, an army of guards arrived at the scene, only to find corpses and no trace of the Nightblood Hound or Uroboros. At the same time, Dolores wiped the sweat from her cheek. She was panting heavily to catch her breath, but being far from the temple now, she felt relieved, as she had almost been caught. Vikir changed the subject and asked her if she had found the ledger. Showing the ledger and a confident smile, she nodded. Vikir took the book and, as his eyes shone with curiosity, he opened it and began to read in silence. With a sad look, Dolores mentioned that the people who were dead in front of the temple moments ago were absolutely unforgivable villains. The image of Charles and the others smiling wickedly came to her mind, as they were evil people who took advantage of people's hearts for their own gain. She remembered that the ground was littered with corpses and blood, and she understood that the method, though radical, was simple and definitive. This was what the Nightblood Hound meant by eradicating them all at once. After catching her breath, she stood up and, with a curious gaze, asked our boy how he had known that Uroboros would appear in this place. Vikir clenched his fist tightly, and noticing this, she felt somewhat confused. Under the moonlight, he revealed that it was the tycoon family, the bourgeois family. Dolores's attention fixed on the book, her eyes widening in confusion, as she didn't know what our boy was talking about. Showing the book, Vikir revealed that they were the masterminds behind all of this. Vikir gave her the book and she began to read. Our boy mentioned that if she looked at the accounting records, she would see that the heretics and sects had been receiving enormous funds from the bourgeois family. With this amount of money, they bought indulgences from the Old Testament faction and probably deepened the internal conflict between the Old and New Testament factions. In a confused tone, she asked why they would do something like that. Vikir began to look at the ground, imagining a golden tree, and explained that the most troublesome ability for demons was divine power. They had probably been planning for a long time to destroy the very foundation of this power. Our boy's eyes widened with certainty, as he understood that all of this was likely a preemptive attempt to eliminate any obstacles before the age of destruction arrived. With a serious expression, Dolores asked him if, this time, he planned to assassinate the key figures of the bourgeois family. Vikir lifted his head and felt somewhat confused. Dolores placed her hand under her chin and began to ponder, pointing out that most members of the bourgeois family probably lived in mansions with strict security measures, and she wondered if it would really be possible to infiltrate and assassinate them in such a place. Vikir mentioned that they had to make them come looking for them this time. Hearing this, Dolores snapped out of her trance, her eyes widening in surprise. Showing a gold coin, Vikir explained that money attracts more money, and they just needed to accumulate so much that the bourgeois family would want to contact them first. With a confident expression, our boy said that, luckily, he knew someone very rich. Several days later, our boy was somewhat annoyed. A woman began to stretch his cheeks and, calling him little brother, said that she had missed him very much. Vikir could do nothing but curse his situation. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.